Have you ever stopped to really think about why societies, across the world ended up so different? Not just like different languages or borders, but their core values, their social setups, even their art.
It does make you wonder, doesn't it? It often feels like there's something deeper going on than just random chance or geography.
Exactly. It feels almost like there's some kind of fundamental blueprint laid down ages ago.
Well, that's exactly the idea we're exploring today.
Mm.
These differences often stem from really basic organizing principles established thousands of years back. They're not just surface-level things. They're more like cultural DNA, shaping how people think and live.
And that brings us perfectly to our deep dive today. We're looking at the truly groundbreaking work of Cheikh Anta Diop, specifically his incredibly influential book, The Cultural Unity of Black Africa, The Domains of Patriarchy and of Matriarchy in Classical Antiquity. Just the title tells you we're stepping into some pretty radical territory.
Oh, absolutely. What's so, well, disruptive about Diop is his main idea. He suggests humanity basically split into two fundamental kinds of societies, or cradles, as he calls them. One mainly matriarchal, the other patriarchal.
Right.
And crucially, he argues these different starting points led to vastly different cultures and ways of seeing the world. It completely challenges a lot of the, standard ideas about how civilizations supposedly evolved in a straight line.
He's not just tweaking history, he's proposing a whole new framework. So our mission here is to unpack this. We'll look at Diop's own fascinating life, really get into his theory of the two cradles, see how he pushed back against the very Eurocentric views of history common in his time.
And crucially, why ancient Egypt is so central to his whole argument about Black African cultural unity.
Exactly. So get ready because this might really shift how you think about history, gender, how societies even get started. Let's get into it.
Yeah, Diop's analysis offers this really comprehensive way to look at African social history,
Yeah.
pushing for, using lots of different fields of study together without just slapping Western ideas onto it. He wanted to understand these societies on their own terms.
Okay, so before we dive into the theory itself, we really need to understand the man, Cheikh Anta Diop. His life, 1923-1986, born in Senegal, was as revolutionary as his ideas. He spent his entire life focused on scholarship, and specifically, as you mentioned, retrieving ancient Egyptian history as Black African history.
Right. He saw it as wrongly separated, needing to be put back into its African context.
And the sheer breadth of his knowledge is just staggering. You expect the history, anthropology, linguistics, Egyptology,
Sure, yeah.
but then you add sociology, prehistory, hieroglyphics, and philosophy and nuclear physics.
I know. It's incredible. He wasn't just collecting degrees. This polymath approach let him connect dots nobody else was seeing. It shows his deep commitment to using rigorous scientific methods like radiocarbon dating to back up his historical arguments.
And you can tell how challenging his ideas were because his main doctoral thesis, his big work, apparently got rejected multiple times.
Really speaks volumes, doesn't it?
Yeah, it hints at the huge resistance he faced from the established academic world. He was really swimming against the current.
But his influence definitely grew. He was involved in important UNESCO projects on ancient scripts, Egyptian and Meroitic. And he was even vice president of the UNESCO Committee for the General History of Africa. That's significant international recognition, helping shape a more global, less colonial view of African history.
But it wasn't just about books and committees for him, was it? His work was intensely political. He was active in Senegalese politics, even faced house arrest, had his passport taken away at one point.
That tells you his ideas, this Afrocentric history challenging the colonial story, were seen as a real threat to the powers that be. Scholarship is activism.
Definitely. And founding that radiocarbon lab at the University of Dakar in '66, that just underlines his commitment to hard science, backing up his theories.
It's that combination, the activism and the rigorous science, that makes him so unique. It's no surprise he was voted, alongside giants like W.E.B. Du Bois, as one of the most influential scholars on the Black world in the 20th century.
And Ife Amadiam's introduction to the book really captures the spirit. She calls his work ammunition for fighting the racisms and a tool to reconstruct a history and culture that had been, plundered for centuries.
Exactly. It's about using history for liberation. Diop himself said his goal was to show this organic cultural unity, hiding beneath what he called deceptive cultural heterogeneity.
He thought the idea that Africa was just this collection of totally separate, unrelated cultures was basically a myth.
A myth, yeah, and a convenient one for justifying colonialism and racism. By saying, look how different they all are, you could argue they lacked unity, couldn't govern themselves. Diop saw his work as directly fighting those fabricated and falsified histories.
And his approach was huge, trying to explain everything, family, state, morals, philosophy, religion, art, by starting with the basic material conditions, the environment, the economy.
That's the key. He believed that stuff climate, resources profoundly shaped the culture that grew out of it, not some inherent racial thing. Understand the material base, and you start to understand the society.
Which he saw as vital, not just for understanding the past, but for the future, too.
Absolutely. He thought understanding these deep cultural patterns was crucial for building strong, unified states in post-colonial Africa. It was about self-knowledge, understanding your strengths and weaknesses to build a self-determined future. Knowledge for action.
Okay, so that focus on material conditions leads us right into the core of his theory. The two irreducible systems, matriarchy and patriarchy. This is where he really breaks new ground.
Totally. He proposes these two distinct cradles. The southern cradle, think Black Africa, ancient Egypt, which he saw as predominantly matriarchal,
Yeah.
and the northern cradle, Eurasia, Indo-European cultures, predominantly patriarchal.
And the really radical part is he says they're irreducible, meaning one doesn't just naturally evolve into the other, right?
Exactly. That's his big challenge to the evolutionist theories of his day. People like Bachofen or Morgan or Engels, who often saw matriarchy as just some, primitive early phase that societies had to grow out of to reach the superior patriarchal stage. Diop says no.
He's saying they're fundamentally different blueprints.
Right. Equally valid, equally complex, just adapted to different circumstances, not rungs on the same ladder.
Okay, let's dig into the southern cradle first. Black Africa, ancient Egypt. What were the material conditions like there, according to Diop?
So the southern cradle, particularly around the Nile and fertile parts of sub-Saharan Africa, was generally blessed with abundant resources and favorable climates. Think agriculture, sedentary life. The Nile flooding predictably, warm climates allowing steady farming.
Stability.
Stability, exactly. That allowed for settled communities, complex social structures built around farming and staying put, rather than constantly moving for survival.
And how did that stability, that agricultural base, shape the family and women's roles?
Hugely. In these societies, the family structure tended to be overwhelmingly matriarchal. Descent was traced matrilineally through the mother's line.
So children belonged to the mother's family group.
Yes, and inheritance, property, titles often passed down the female line too. Think about groups like the Bantu or the Ashanti. The mother-child bond was central, the foundation of everything. The woman, as life giver and often main farmer, held real social and economic power.
So the mother's line was paramount. What about marriage? How did that work?
Often metrolocal, meaning the husband moves to the wife's family home, a total flip from many patriarchal systems. Diop also mentions interesting details, like a woman's marriage bond might not break just because she traveled, showing her independence. And economically, women were crucial mistresses of the house, keepers of the food. Their farm labor wasn't just helpful, it was often the backbone of the economy.
And it went beyond just practical roles, didn't it? There was a deeper respect.
Oh, definitely. Diop talks about the sacredness and unlimited authority of the mother. It was deep respect, almost reverence. And he points to history, Queen Hatshepsut ruling Egypt as pharaoh, Queen Candace of Ethiopia standing up to Rome. These weren't exceptions. They showed women as leaders, warriors, powerful figures.
A stark contrast to, say, ancient Greece or Rome.
Absolutely, where women were often confined, hidden away. Diop sees this southern matriarchy not as primitive, but as a harmonious dualism, a partnership between sexes aiming for a stable society where everyone could thrive.
Okay, now let's make that sharp turn to the northern cradle, Eurasia, Indo-European cultures. What were the conditions there?
Very different. Think nomadic pastoral life, herding animals across vast plains or steppes, often in harsher climates. Diop mentions the icy northern cold, less fertile land, constant movement, often competition for resources.
So a life geared towards mobility, maybe conflict.
Exactly. Social organization revolves around movement, defense, maybe conquest, a completely different vibe from the settled agricultural South.
And how did that shape family and gender roles?
Overwhelmingly patriarchal. Descent traced patrilineally through the father. The male head of the family held the power, controlled property, lineage.
And women.
Generally subordinated, often confined to the home like the Genesium in Greece. Limited public roles. Their value often tied to producing male heirs or the dowry they brought.
Oh, the dowry.
Right, which often made marriage more of an economic deal, reinforcing male control. Diop argues this patriarchy, born from these harsh mobile conditions, inherently leads to controlling women unlike the harmonious dualism he saw in the South.
Such a fundamental split, and these differences obviously ripple outwards, shaping entire worldviews, values, religion, society. Let's unpack that. Starting with the basic values, the sort of spirit of each cradle.
The contrast is really stark. In the Southern cradle, Diop highlights values like the emancipation of women, a focus on peace, justice, goodness, and a generally optimistic view of life. Yeah, stemming from that relative stability and abundance, perhaps, there was a strong sense of community, social collectivism, mutual support. Diop even notes a relative lack of poverty and crime because people looked out for each other. And crucially, no concept of original sin. Humans weren't seen as inherently flawed.
Wow. A very positive communal outlook. And the North.
Almost the opposite.
Yeah.
Characterized by a sense of tragedy, ideals wrapped up in war, violence, conquest. Think of the epic poems, the warrior heroes. Pervaded by individualism, but also guilt, original sin, leading to a more pessimistic, maybe fatalistic view of life.
And xenophobia, mistrust of outsiders.
Often, yes.
Yeah.
Which kind of makes sense in a competitive mobile world where you're defending limited resources from other groups.
It's amazing how these core conditions then show up so clearly in religion. How did they view the divine differently?
In the Southern cradle, you see widespread mother goddess worship. Isis in Egypt is the prime example, goddess of grain, fertility, magic. Directly tied to agriculture, women's role in providing life and food. It reflects that optimistic connection to nature's cycles.
And ancestor worship.
Hugely important, but often about keeping ancestors present, like a living fire in the home, symbolizing ongoing connection, not just tombs far away. Diop also finds specific links, like the Egyptian god Amon having counterparts with similar names and roles in West Africa, suggests a shared spiritual foundation.
And the Northern cradle's religion.
Predominantly a male sky god, Zeus, Jupiter, Jehovah, often associated with power, judgment, the heavens fitting that more individualistic, sometimes harsh worldview.
And things like cremation.
Yeah, fire worship and cremation were common. Tied to nomadic life, you can't easily maintain fixed burial grounds if you're always moving. It reflects that lack of permanent settlement.
It really does shape everything, down to the idea of the state itself. Patriotism, government. How did that differ?
For the South, Diop saw patriotism as growing naturally out of agricultural settlement. Clans grew into villages, then larger regions like the Egyptian nomes or provinces, united but locally rooted.
And the state's purpose?
Tied to that social collectivism. Its job was public welfare, ensuring prosperity, managing resources like irrigation for the good of all. Royalty, like pharaohs, weren't just rulers. They were seen as almost divine forces, ensuring cosmic balance, good harvests, collective well-being. Living symbols of unity.
So the state as a community caretaker, and in the North?
Patriotism, there was often linked more to the city-state, standing alone, often competitive, maybe expansionist. Think Greek city-states or Rome's ambitions. Characterized by individualism, that xenophobia we mentioned, and a tendency towards conflict.
And royalty.
Often based on power, granted by that male sky god. Emphasizing conquest, control, maybe divine right over others. The state could be more about enforcing order, protecting private property, projecting power outwards rather than collective welfare.
And you could see this pessimistic, individualistic streak in their stories too, right, in literature?
Absolutely. Southern literature, including Egyptian, tends towards optimism. Novels, fables, comedies, tales where justice prevails. Diop makes a fascinating point. The Egyptians, with thousands of years of history, didn't really do tragedy.
No Oedipus Rex.
Right. Because their fundamental worldview, lacking that inherent guilt or original sin, didn't naturally lead to stories of inescapable doom or flawed heroes punished by fate.
Whereas the North
is steeped in the tragic worldview. Greek tragedy, Aeschylus, Sophocles is the classic example. Nietzsche explored it philosophically. It reflects that sense of struggle, guilt, violence, individual suffering against powerful forces, whether gods or fate or circumstance. Life as a constant battle.
So Diop is basically saying these aren't just random cultural variations. They're two fundamentally different ways of being human rooted in the environment, which leads us to how he directly confronted the dominant historical theories of his time.
Yes, this is where he really goes head-to-head with established thinking. He's critiquing what he saw as biased, Eurocentric universal narratives.
Specifically those evolutionist theories, right? Beethoven, Morgan, Engels.
Exactly. These thinkers often portrayed matriarchy as, well, primitive, maybe a stage of sexual promiscuity or barbarism, as they sometimes put it, something societies had to move beyond to achieve civilization, which inevitably meant patriarchy.
Beethoven's reading of Greek myths, like the Oresteia, as patriarchy triumphing over matriarchy.
That's a key example Diop attacks. Bachofen saw it as progress, the male principle rightly defeating the older, chaotic female one. This view basically baked in the idea that patriarchy was superior.
And Diop just completely rejected this linear progression.
Fundamentally, he insisted his two cradles were irreducible parallel developments. Matriarchy wasn't a stepping stone. It was a distinct, valid, highly developed system, especially in the South. They weren't stages on one path. They were different paths altogether.
He didn't hold back on criticizing these guys, did he? What was his issue with Bachofen specifically?
He called Bachofen's view a prejudiced judgment. He argued Bachofen misunderstood motherhood's actual role and even pointed out how many patriarchal rituals seemed to imitate female procreation, trying to claim that power symbolically. Diop felt Bachofen just couldn't see matriarchy as anything other than inferior because of his own cultural bias.
And Lewis H. Morgan, a huge figure in early anthropology.
Diop called Morgan's work, particularly his classification of Aryans as civilized and others as savages, flat-out racist. He argued Morgan's theories provided the perfect intellectual justification for colonialism, label other societies primitive, and you can justify ruling them.
So Morgan's framework propped up imperialism.
That was Diop's argument. He also thought Morgan's ideas about kinship and family evolution were messy and ethnocentric, failing to grasp the real complexity and diversity of systems worldwide, especially in Africa.
Even Engels, often seen as more progressive.
Diop acknowledged. Engels tried to show family structures weren't fixed, that they had a history. But he still felt Engels was biased towards the bourgeois monogamous family as the end point. And like the others, Engels couldn't explain a universal switch from matriarchy to patriarchy because, for Diop, it just didn't happen universally.
So Diop wasn't just correcting historical details. He was attacking the entire framework that ranked civilizations on a single ladder, with Europe at the top.
Precisely. He saw the whole idea of African cultures being heterogeneous, too fragmented to have a common root as a deliberate illusion, a deceptive appearance used to deny African unity and justify colonial rule.
Divide and conquer intellectually.
You got it. His work was about tearing down those fabricated and falsified narratives and reclaiming an African-centered history. It was intellectual ammunition against racism and colonialism.
Which brings us right back to ancient Egypt. For Diop, this wasn't just some separate Mediterranean thing. It was the heart of the southern cradle.
The absolute core. He saw Egypt as the place where matriarchy was most manifest and long-lasting. It was fundamentally agrarian, matriarchal. Look at Isis, goddess of grain, fertility, central to everything.
And those royal brother-sister marriages, how did he explain those? They seem pretty unusual.
Through that matriarchal lens, he argued it was a direct result of matrilineal law. If the queen's lineage determined who could be pharaoh, marrying her brother, who shared that royal maternal blood, kept the power, the legitimacy, and the property strictly within that female line. It preserved the matriarchal power structure at the highest level.
Okay, that makes sense within that system. And Egyptian women generally had more freedom.
Much more than their Greek or Roman counterparts, Diop argued. They could own property, run businesses, participate in public life. He famously said the pivot of society is woman. In Egypt, they were central.
So Egypt wasn't an outlier. It was the prime example. And crucially, he tied it directly to the rest of Black Africa.
That was his lifelong mission. Showing Egyptian history is Black African history. Figures like Hatshepsut, the female pharaoh, or Queen Candace, weren't weird exceptions. They were proof of this deep tradition of powerful African women leaders, part of the Southern cradle fabric.
And he brought hard evidence, specifically linguistic evidence, didn't he? This is where his multidisciplinary skills really came in.
Yes, and it's incredibly compelling. He found deep structural links between ancient Egyptian and modern African languages, especially Wolof from Senegal, not just a few borrowed words, but core grammar.
Like what? Can you give an example?
Sure. He points to verb conjugations. The verb kayif, meaning to seize, appears with similar grammatical structures in both classical Egyptian from, say, 2000 BC and in modern Wolof spoken today. That's a shared structure surviving thousands of years.
Wow, that is specific, not just a coincidence.
Exactly. He also found shared roots for key concepts, like gen, relating to paternal lineage in Egyptian, also found in Wolof, or bar, relating to speech in Wolof, may be connected to the Indo-European barbarian, meaning unintelligible speaker. And religiously, the West African god Amon clearly corresponds to the Egyptian Amon. These aren't surface similarities, they point to a deep, shared heritage.
So language, religion, any other cultural parallels?
Yes, ancestor worship. deeply ingrained in both ancient Egypt and across Black Africa, very different from the northern focus. Also, shared reverence for certain animals. Totemic traditions where clans identify with an animal ancestor. You see patterns linking Egypt and other African cultures. And even philosophy, the Bantu concept of life force and interconnectedness aligns remarkably with ancient Egyptian cosmology. It all builds a picture of a unified cultural zone.
Okay, so his theory is comprehensive, but what about things that seem to contradict it, like Hatshepsut dressing as a man, or later Greek influence? How did Diop handle those apparent anomalies?
He tackled them head-on, using them to refine his view. With Hatshepsut, he argued her reign wasn't an anomaly against matriarchy, but proof of its strength. Matrilineal succession made her rule legitimate.
But the beard, the male clothes.
He saw that as symbolic, a way to perform the public role of pharaoh, which had established male iconography, perhaps for dealing with male-dominated neighbors. It wasn't her denying her womanhood or matriarchy, it was pragmatically using symbols of power available to her, showing the system's flexibility. She ruled as a woman, leveraging the power derived from her female lineage.
Interesting. And later, under Greek Ptolemies, did matriarchy vanish?
Diop argued no. Even with Greek rulers, core Egyptian noble families held onto matriarchal values and matrilineal succession. It showed the deep resilience of those structures, even under foreign patriarchal influence. Cleopatra herself, though Greek, understood and used Egyptian ideas of queenly power.
What about the Amazons? Those myths of warrior women. Western takes are often quite negative.
Diop flips that. He sees Amazon myths not as some cynical triumph of woman over man, but as reflecting real female warriors in matriarchal societies, like the historical Dahomey Amazons in West Africa. These weren't man-haters, they were women defending their societies, their independence. It showed the strength possible when women weren't subjugated.
And polygamy, often seen purely as oppressive to women.
Diop offers a more nuanced view for the African context. He acknowledged it existed, but argued it didn't automatically mean mistreatment like it might in other patriarchal contexts. Often it was tied to economics. Women's crucial role in farming meant more wives could mean a more prosperous household. It was a social norm, he argued, often with customs protecting wives' rights, not necessarily a sign of female subjugation compared to, say, the often harsh realities for women under European patriarchy.
Okay, but if Africa was fundamentally matriarchal, how does he explain patriarchal systems found there today? That seems like a big challenge.
He attributes that largely to external influences, primarily the historical spread of Islam and Christianity. He saw these patriarchal religions and the cultures they brought as layering over the original matriarchal base.
So like a veneer?
Kind of, yeah. A surface phenomenon, as he put it. Impactful, yes, but he believed it didn't completely erase the underlying matriarchal structures and values, which remained resilient in many customs and social attitudes, often subtly influencing life even within outwardly patriarchal systems.
Right, wow. Okay, so summing this all up, Diop's conclusion is really profound. These two cradles, Southern matriarchal African and Northern patriarchal Eurasian, aren't just different styles. They're fundamentally distinct systems, born from different material realities, shaping everything. Family, values, religion, art, the state.
Everything. The Southern cradle, rooted in agriculture, leading to matriarchal families, large territorial states focused on welfare, empowered women, collectivism, optimism, justice, a whole way of being built on cooperation and relative abundance.
Compared to the Northern cradle.
Rooted often in nomadic pastoralism, leading to patriarchal families, competitive city-states, subordinated women, individualism, sometimes violence, guilt, pessimism, tragedy. Just a completely different trajectory, born from struggle and scarcity.
And his work isn't just history. It feels incredibly relevant now.
Absolutely. It's a blueprint, as you said, for an African-centered social history. It pushes back against colonial narratives, gives intellectual ammunition against racism, as Semyon said. It urges scholars, especially African ones, to deconstruct, invalidate, and reconstruct those imposed ways of thinking. It's about reclaiming identity and agency.
So the final thought then, if knowledge is really about understanding and applying it, how should recognizing these incredibly deep, different historical roots, these cradles, change how we look at the world today? Global challenges, relations between cultures, maybe even what we mean by progress or development, especially if those very ideas grew out of one specific cradle soil.
That's the big question, isn't it? If societies fundamentally operate on different cultural software, stemming from these ancient divergences, how do we build bridges? How do we understand each other authentically? It challenges us to see that there might be multiple valid paths forward, rooted in different histories, different values.
Definitely something to keep thinking about, a lot to unpack there.